June 25, 1944, Imperial Palace, Tokyo. Emperor Hirohito's hands trembled slightly as he held the decoded message from Saipan. His advisors had just confirmed what he had desperately tried to deny for 9 days. The island fortress, considered impregnable just weeks earlier, was collapsing under the weight of American firepower. "All is lost, Your Majesty," whispered Marquis Koichi Kido, Lord Keeper of the Privy Seal and the Emperor's closest confidant. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. For the first time since the war began, Imperial General Headquarters was forced to use language that acknowledged defeat. Not tactical withdrawal, not strategic repositioning. Defeat. Through the ornate windows of his palace study, Hirohito could see Tokyo spreading beneath summer skies. Within months, those same skies would rain fire. The loss of Saipan meant American B-29 Superfortress bombers could reach every major city in Japan. The capital itself lay just 1,500 miles north of the Mariana Islands, well within the combat radius of the massive 4-engine bombers already assembling on Pacific Island bases. The Emperor demanded to know when his naval forces would counterattack to retake the island. His advisors exchanged glances heavy with unspoken truth. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, Commander-in-Chief of the combined fleet, had already attempted that counterattack. The result became known among American pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter so one-sided that it effectively ended Japanese naval aviation as a fighting force. The mathematics of annihilation were stark. On June 19th and 20th, in the waters west of the Mariana Islands, the Imperial Japanese Navy had committed 9 aircraft carriers and over 400 carrier-based aircraft to prevent the American invasion of Saipan. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded the mobile fleet with confidence born from Japan's early war victories. His pilots would strike from longer range than American aircraft could match. His land-based air forces from Guam and other islands would supplement the carrier strikes. The Americans would be caught in a coordinated aerial vice. Every assumption proved catastrophically wrong. American radar detected the Japanese strikes while they were still over 100 miles away. The F-6F Hellcat fighters, superior to the aging Zero in every category except maneuverability, tore through the Japanese formations like wolves through sheep. American pilots, many with hundreds of hours of training, faced Japanese aviators rushed into combat with barely enough flight time to land on carriers. The quality gap was murderous. On June 19th alone, the Americans shot down over 300 Japanese aircraft while losing fewer than 30 of their own. Lieutenant Junior Grade Alexander Vrasiu became an instant legend by shooting down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes. Aboard the USS Lexington, one pilot was heard to remark, "Hell, this is like an old-time turkey shoot." The name stuck. But the aerial massacre was only part of Japan's disaster. American submarines USS Albacore and USS Kavala stalked the Japanese fleet with patience honed through 3 years of Pacific warfare. Albacore's torpedoes found the fleet carrier Taiho, the newest and most advanced carrier in the Japanese fleet. A single torpedo hit triggered a series of explosions that eventually consumed the entire ship. Over 1,600 sailors died. Kavala's torpedoes struck the veteran carrier Shokaku, survivor of Pearl Harbor and multiple carrier battles. The torpedoes ruptured aviation fuel lines, and within hours the ship was an inferno. 1,200 men perished in the flames. On June 20th, American carrier aircraft found the retreating Japanese fleet and sank the carrier Hio, while damaging 2 others. When Ozawa's battered fleet limped back to Japanese waters, it had lost 3 fleet carriers, over 600 aircraft, and thousands of irreplaceable pilots and aircrew. The Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier striking force, the weapon that had dominated the Pacific for 18 months after Pearl Harbor, effectively ceased to exist. The Navy could still sail, it could still fight, but it could no longer project air power across the vast distances of the Pacific. Without carrier aviation, the combined fleet became little more than expensive target practice for American submarines and aircraft. While the naval disaster unfolded, American Marines and soldiers were fighting their way across Saipan against defenders who understood they were fighting the battle that would determine Japan's fate. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanded 30,000 Japanese troops dug into the island's volcanic ridges and coral caves. He had been told by Prime Minister Hideki Tojo himself, "The fate of the Japanese Empire depends on the result of your operation." The American invasion fleet that appeared off Saipan on June 15th was an industrial marvel that Japan could never hope to match. Over 500 ships carried 70,000 assault troops, supported by 15 aircraft carriers. The preliminary bombardment alone consumed more shells than the entire Japanese military production could replace in a month. When the first waves of Marines hit the beaches in their amphibious tractors, they came ashore into a storm of machine gun and artillery fire that killed or wounded over 3,000 men in the first day. But 20,000 Marines reached the shore that first day, and more arrived every hour. The Japanese defenders inflicted terrible casualties, but they could not stop the advance. Each Japanese position fought until overrun. Then the Americans moved forward to the next defensive line. The volcanic island's highest point, Mount Tapochau, 1,500 feet above sea level, became a fortress honeycomb with caves and tunnels. Marines fighting their way up the slopes gave the terrain features names that told the story of the battle: Purple Heart Ridge, Death Valley, Hell's Pocket. The fighting lasted 24 days. General Saito, accepting that his position was hopeless, organized one final attack that would become legendary in the annals of Pacific warfare. On July 7th, he assembled every able-bodied defender and ordered a Gyokusai attack, a term that translates as shattering the jewel. This was not a tactical maneuver designed to achieve military objectives. This was mass suicide, disguised as a banzai charge, a death ceremony intended to preserve honor through annihilation. Approximately 4,000 Japanese soldiers, many wounded and barely able to walk, some armed only with sharpened bamboo poles, attacked American positions in the pre-dawn darkness. They came singing their death songs, officers waving swords overhead, wounded men hobbling forward on makeshift crutches, civilians pressed into service charging alongside soldiers. The attack fell primarily on 2 battalions of the U.S. Army's 105th Infantry Regiment, which lost over 900 casualties in 15 hours of desperate close-quarters combat. The Americans held their positions, but the ferocity of the attack shook even hardened veterans. When daylight revealed the battlefield, over 4,000 Japanese bodies carpeted the ground. The attack had achieved nothing except to hasten the deaths of the defenders. General Saito never led the charge he ordered. He committed ritual suicide in his cave headquarters before the attack began, as did Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the naval commander who had led the carrier force at Pearl Harbor. On July 9th, Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner declared Saipan secure. The Japanese garrison was annihilated. Of 30,000 defenders, fewer than 1,000 survived to be captured, most of them because they were unconscious or too badly wounded to resist. American casualties exceeded 16,000, including over 3,000 dead, but the Americans could replace those losses. Japan could not. The civilian population on Saipan witnessed horrors that foreshadowed what might await the Japanese home islands if invasion came. Japanese propaganda had told civilians that Americans were barbarians who would torture and murder anyone they captured. Thousands of Japanese civilians, faced with the choice between surrender to Americans or death, chose death. At Marpi Point on Saipan's northern coast, American forces watched in horror as families jumped from 800-foot cliffs to their deaths on the rocks below. Parents threw their children over the edge before jumping themselves. Others walked into the surf to drown. Some used grenades to kill themselves and their families. Over 1,000 civilians died this way. American soldiers and Marines shouted pleas through loudspeakers, begging the civilians to surrender, promising safety. Naval vessels positioned below the cliffs tried to rescue people. From the water, nothing stopped the mass suicide. The waters below Marpi Point became so thick with floating bodies that small craft could barely navigate without running over corpses. The scene burned itself into the memory of every American who witnessed it and raised terrible questions about what an invasion of the Japanese home islands might cost in civilian lives. News of Saipan's fall reached Tokyo on July 9th. The government could not hide this defeat. Saipan was not some distant coral atoll that most Japanese had never heard of. The Mariana Islands had been Japanese territory since the end of World War I, administered under League of Nations mandate. Japanese civilians lived on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Japanese children attended schools there. The loss was personal in ways that defeats in New Guinea or the Solomon Islands could never be. For the first time in the war, Imperial General Headquarters issued a public statement acknowledging a major defeat. The carefully worded announcement described the extremely critical situation and admitted that Saipan had fallen despite the heroic resistance of its defenders. The Japanese people, who had been fed a steady diet of victory propaganda for 3 years, suddenly confronted the reality that their military could not stop American advances. Emperor Hirohito's reaction was volcanic. According to multiple accounts from palace officials, he demanded immediate action to recapture Saipan. He convened the board of field marshals and fleet admirals to determine if retaking the island was possible. The military leaders could offer him nothing but carefully worded evasions. Recapturing Saipan would require amphibious forces Japan no longer possessed, naval supremacy Japan had just lost, and air power that no longer existed. The emperor's brother, Prince Takamatsu, wrote in his diary that Hirohito flares up frequently in the days following Saipan's fall. The divine emperor, who rarely showed emotion, was displaying anger that terrified his advisors. But anger could not change strategic reality. With Saipan in American hands, the war was entering its final phase. The only questions remaining were how long it would last, and how many would die before Japan accepted the inevitable. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the man most identified with Japan's war effort, became the inevitable scapegoat. The Jushin, the council of elder statesmen that advised the emperor, concluded that Tojo must go. These senior politicians, including all former prime ministers, approached Emperor Hirohito with their recommendation. The emperor, breaking with tradition, sent Tojo a message making clear that the man responsible for the Saipan disaster was not worthy of imperial approval. Tojo attempted to reorganize his cabinet to regain the emperor's confidence. He was rebuffed. When it became clear that Tojo had lost imperial support, his political enemies moved swiftly. On July 18th, Tojo and his entire cabinet resigned. He was replaced by General Kuniaki Koiso, chosen more for his political malleability than his military competence. The change in leadership would make no difference to the war's outcome, but it signaled that Japan's ruling elite had begun, however reluctantly, to accept that victory was no longer possible. The strategic implications of losing the Marianas extended far beyond providing bomber bases. The islands had been part of Japan's absolute national defense zone, the defensive perimeter established in September 1943 as the last line that must be held at all costs. The zone ran from western New Guinea through the Caroline Islands to the Marianas, encompassing resources and positions considered vital to Japan's survival. Losing any part of this perimeter was supposed to trigger the decisive naval battle where Japan would defeat the American fleet and force a negotiated peace. The decisive naval battle had been fought. Japan lost. The defense perimeter collapsed. There would be no negotiated peace. The Americans had made clear from the beginning that only unconditional surrender would end the war. The fall of Saipan forced Japanese leadership to confront what unconditional surrender actually meant. It meant the end of the government, the end of the military system, possibly the end of the imperial system itself. For leaders raised in a culture where personal honor was paramount and national dishonor was intolerable, these implications were almost too terrible to contemplate. Yet military reality compelled them to think the unthinkable. With the Marianas lost, American forces could island hop westward toward the Philippines, cutting Japan off from oil resources in the Dutch East Indies. Those oil resources were Japan's economic lifeline. Without oil from the Indies, the combined fleet could not sail, aircraft could not fly, and industry could not function. Japan's entire war economy depended on maintaining that connection. Simultaneously, from bases in the Marianas, American B-29 bombers could strike Japan's cities and industrial centers with impunity. The B-29 Superfortress was unlike any bomber Japan had ever faced. It could carry 10 tons of bombs 1,500 miles, cruise at 300 miles per hour, and operate at altitudes above 30,000 feet where Japanese interceptors struggled to reach. Its defensive armament was formidable, with multiple remotely controlled gun turrets that could destroy attacking fighters from beyond their effective range. Construction crews had begun building airfields on Saipan before the fighting even ended. Navy Seabees worked around the clock to extend runways and create the infrastructure needed to base hundreds of heavy bombers. By October 1944, the first B-29s were arriving at what Americans now called Isley Field. On November 24th, 111 B-29s took off from Saipan, bound for Tokyo in the first major raid on the Japanese capital since the Doolittle Raid of April 1942. The November raid caused limited damage, but it shattered any remaining Japanese illusions about homeland security. If American bombers could reach Tokyo, they could reach anywhere in Japan. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese civilians had been told their homeland was invulnerable, protected by invincible military forces and divine providence. Now they cowered in shelters as air raid sirens wailed and B-29s droned overhead in formations so large they darkened the sky. The bombing campaign would escalate through winter and spring. In March 1945, General Curtis LeMay changed tactics from high-altitude precision bombing to low-altitude incendiary attacks. On the night of March 9th through 10th, over 300 B-29s dropped nearly 2,000 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. This single raid killed more people than would die in the atomic bombing of Hiroshima 5 months later. Similar fire raids followed against Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other cities. By war's end, American bombers had destroyed 40% of the built-up area in 66 Japanese cities. The industrial capacity that Japan needed to continue fighting was systematically incinerated, yet the bombing alone did not force surrender. Japanese military leaders, even recognizing that defeat was inevitable, could not bring themselves to accept unconditional surrender. The fall of Tinian and Guam in August 1944 completed American conquest of the Marianas. Tinian became the largest airbase in the world, with 4 enormous runways supporting hundreds of B-29s. From North Field on Tinian, the 509th Composite Group would launch the Enola Gay and Boxcar on their atomic missions in August 1945. The infrastructure built in the Marianas represented American industrial capacity, operating at a scale Japan could never approach. In Tokyo, military planners tried to devise strategies that might salvage something from impending defeat. The plan they developed, Operation Ketsugo, called for defending the home islands with every available resource in one final decisive battle. Newly raised militia would fight alongside regular troops. Civilians would be armed with bamboo spears if necessary. Thousands of kamikaze aircraft would attack invasion fleets. The goal was not to win, which everyone recognized as impossible, but to make invasion so costly that Americans might negotiate a peace that preserved the imperial system. Operation Ketsugo was predicated on the belief that Americans, being soft democratic people who valued individual lives, would balk at the casualties required to invade Japan. Japanese planners expected the decisive battle to occur when Americans invaded the southern island of Kyushu, probably in late 1945. They calculated that if Japanese forces could inflict casualties comparable to Iwo Jima and Okinawa, where American losses exceeded 100,000 for 2 small islands, Americans might reconsider invasion of the main islands. This calculation contained a fundamental misunderstanding of American resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor had united Americans in determination to defeat Japan completely, whatever the cost. President Franklin Roosevelt's demand for unconditional surrender had bipartisan support. No negotiated peace would be acceptable. The only question was whether invasion would be necessary, or if Japan could be forced to surrender through blockade, bombing, and the threat of invasion. The Japanese government attempted to use the Soviet Union as mediator to negotiate better surrender terms. This strategy was delusional on multiple levels. The Soviets had no interest in helping Japan negotiate peace. Stalin had promised at Yalta to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's surrender. He intended to seize territory in Manchuria and Korea, while positioning the Soviet Union for influence in post-war Asia. Japanese diplomatic overtures to Moscow were politely received and completely ignored. Meanwhile, the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, The Big Six, who controlled Japanese policy, remained deadlocked between those who wanted to continue fighting and those who recognized the need to end the war. Prime Minister Admiral Kantaro Suzuki, who replaced Koiso in April 1945, wanted peace but could not break the deadlock without imperial intervention. The military members of the council, War Minister Korichika Anami, and the chiefs of staff for Army and Navy insisted Japan should fight to the end. The stalemate continued even as American forces captured Iwo Jima in February and Okinawa in June. Iwo Jima cost 27,000 American casualties to capture 8 square miles of volcanic rock. Okinawa, fought from April through June, cost over 50,000 American casualties and killed between 100,000 and 150,000 Japanese, including perhaps 100,000 Okinawan civilians caught in the crossfire or driven to suicide. Each battle demonstrated what Japanese leaders had understood since Saipan fell. Japan could inflict terrible casualties, but could not prevent eventual defeat. American industrial capacity and determination were inexhaustible. Japan's resources were exhausted. The question was whether Japanese leadership would accept this reality before the nation was completely destroyed. The answer came only after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki in early August, and the Soviet Union declared war and invaded Manchuria. Even then, the Supreme Council deadlocked 3-3 on whether to accept the Potsdam Declaration demanding unconditional surrender. Emperor Hirohito, in an unprecedented intervention, broke the deadlock by accepting surrender terms. His decision came not primarily from the atomic bombs, though they horrified him, but from the combination of strategic circumstances that had been building since Saipan fell. With the Marianas lost, Japan's strategic situation became hopeless. The Navy could not prevent further American advances. The Air Force could not defend against B-29 raids. The Army could not defeat an American invasion. The atomic bombs demonstrated that the United States possessed weapons that could destroy entire cities in single attacks, rendering meaningless any defensive preparations. Soviet entry into the war eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement and threatened to turn the war into a fight on 2 fronts that Japan absolutely could not sustain. In his surrender, broadcast on August 15th, Emperor Hirohito did not mention the atomic bombs specifically. Instead, he spoke in careful terms about a new and most cruel bomb, but emphasized that continuing the war would not only result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but also it would lead to the total extinction of human civilization. He was acknowledging what Japan's military leadership had understood since the fall of Saipan. The war was lost, and continuing to fight would only add to the catastrophe. The fall of the Marianas did not immediately end the war, but it made the ending inevitable. From June 1944 forward, every Japanese military and political leader with access to accurate information understood that Japan could not win. The question was whether they would admit this reality in time to save something from the wreckage, or whether Japan would fight to complete destruction. The numbers tell the story of mathematical impossibility. In 1944, the United States produced over 96,000 aircraft. Japan produced 28,000. American shipyards launched multiple aircraft carriers, hundreds of destroyers and submarines, and thousands of merchant vessels. Japan could barely replace its losses. American factories were producing so many tanks, trucks, weapons, and ammunition that much of it sat unused. Japan struggled to equip its forces with basic necessities. American pilot training programs graduated 30,000 new pilots in 1944 alone. Japanese programs could not replace the pilots lost in the Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots entered combat with 400 hours of flight time and extensive gunnery training. Japanese pilots flew into battle with less than 100 hours total flight time and minimal weapons training. The quality gap in aircrew matched the quality gap in equipment. Most devastatingly, the United States could absorb losses that would cripple Japan. When the Navy lost 3 carriers at Midway in 1942, it hurt, but did not cripple American operations. When Japan lost 4 carriers at Midway, the defeat marked a turning point from which the combined fleet never recovered. When Marines suffered 16,000 casualties taking Saipan, replacements filled the ranks within weeks. When Japan lost 30,000 defending Saipan, those troops could never be replaced. The strategic reality that Japanese leadership confronted after the Marianas was this: continuing the war meant watching Japan systematically destroyed while accomplishing nothing except adding to the death toll. Surrender meant occupation, loss of empire, trial of war criminals, and fundamental transformation of Japanese society. Both options were terrible, but only one preserved any possibility of national survival. Japanese military culture made accepting this reality almost impossible. Bushido tradition held that death was preferable to surrender. Military indoctrination had taught that the emperor was divine and Japan's cause was sacred. Surrendering meant admitting these fundamental beliefs were wrong. For individuals and institutions whose entire identity was built on these beliefs, surrender meant annihilation of self. Yet the fall of the Marianas created a crack in the edifice of denial. Saipan demonstrated that the Americans could and would take any position Japan held, regardless of cost. The Turkish Shoot demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation was finished. The B-29 raids demonstrated that Japanese cities could be destroyed at will. Each subsequent battle expanded that crack until the whole structure of pretense collapsed in August 1945. Looking back from the perspective of decades, the question is not why Japan surrendered when it did, but why Japanese leadership waited so long to acknowledge the inevitable. The answer lies in the intersection of culture, politics, and individual psychology. No Japanese leader wanted to be the one who presided over national defeat. No general wanted to admit his forces could not win. No admiral wanted to acknowledge naval supremacy was lost. No politician wanted to face the consequences of surrender. So, they fought on, month after month, battle after battle, knowing they could not win but unable to accept defeat. The fall of the Marianas forced them to confront reality, but accepting reality required another year and further disasters. In that year, hundreds of thousands more died, dozens more cities burned, and Japan descended into a nightmare from which it emerged only through unconditional surrender and foreign occupation. The legacy of the Marianas campaign extends beyond its immediate military consequences. The battle established patterns that would define the rest of the Pacific War. American industrial and technological superiority would continue to grow while Japanese capabilities declined. American forces would continue amphibious operations that seized islands closer to Japan while systematically destroying Japanese defensive positions. The bombing campaign would escalate until Japanese cities were reduced to ash. Japanese military resistance would remain fierce to the end, with garrison after garrison fighting to annihilation rather than surrender. Civilian casualties would mount as Japanese propaganda convinced civilians that death was preferable to American occupation. The war would grind toward its conclusion with a terrible inevitability that everyone could see, but Japanese leadership seemed unable to stop. The fall of Saipan on July 9, 1944, marked the moment when Japan's strategic defeat became mathematically certain. Everything that followed was denouement, the working out of consequences that were already determined. Japanese leaders understood this. The fall of Tojo's government acknowledged this. The desperate attempts to negotiate through Moscow acknowledged this. The increasingly frantic defensive preparations acknowledged this. But understanding defeat intellectually and accepting it emotionally are different things. Japanese leadership could see that the war was lost after the Marianas fell, but they could not bring themselves to surrender until the combination of atomic bombs and Soviet invasion made continuation literally impossible. In the months between recognition and acceptance, Japan paid a terrible price in lives, cities, and future prospects. The men who fought and died defending Saipan believed they were protecting the homeland. In a sense, they were. Every day they delayed, the Americans was one more day that Japanese cities stood intact and Japanese civilians lived in relative safety. But the delay was temporary, the protection illusory. The fall of the Marianas ensured that B-29s would eventually reach Japan, that the bombing campaign would devastate Japanese cities, and that invasion forces would eventually threaten the home islands themselves. The strategic reality that Japanese High Command confronted in July 1944 remained unchanged until surrender in August 1945. Japan could not win, could not force a negotiated peace, could only delay the inevitable while paying in blood for each day of delay. Whether that delay was worth the cost is a question Japanese historians still debate. What is beyond debate is that the fall of the Marianas made the outcome certain. In the ornate halls of the Imperial Palace, in the concrete bunkers of the Army General Staff, in the war rooms of the Combined Fleet Headquarters, Japanese leaders understood after June 1944 that they were presiding over national defeat. Some wanted to acknowledge this immediately and seek the best surrender terms available. Others insisted that fighting to the end would somehow preserve national honor or produce divine intervention. The debate between these positions would paralyze Japanese decision-making for another year. But the debate's outcome was predetermined by American bombs falling on Saipan in June 1944. When those bombs breached Japan's inner defensive ring and created bases from which American bombers could reach Tokyo, the war entered its endgame. Japanese high command knew it. The emperor knew it. The question was when and how they would admit what they knew to the Japanese people and to themselves. The answer came in August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio speakers across Japan, telling his people that they must endure the unendurable and suffer what is insufferable. The war that had begun with such confidence at Pearl Harbor ended with unconditional surrender and foreign occupation. The transformation from victory to defeat had taken less than 4 years. But the decisive moment, the point where victory became impossible and defeat inevitable, came in June and July 1944, when the Marianas fell and Japanese strategic planners confronted the mathematics of their situation. Everything after the Marianas was confirmation of what Japanese leadership already knew. The war was lost, the cause was hopeless, and continuing to fight would only add to the catastrophe. They fought anyway, bound by culture and psychology and politics into a death spiral from which only imperial intervention could extract the nation. When that intervention finally came in August 1945, it came too late to save hundreds of thousands of lives and dozens of cities. But it came, and the war ended. The fall of the Marianas made that ending inevitable. The only question was how much more would be destroyed before Japanese leadership accepted what they had understood since summer 1944. The empire was finished, the divine wind would not blow, and unconditional surrender was the only path forward. That understanding, bought with 30,000 Japanese lives on Saipan alone, became the foundation on which post-war Japan would rebuild. But in July 1944, standing in the wreckage of their strategic position, Japanese leaders could see only disaster ahead. They were not wrong. The disaster came, exactly as they feared. The difference was that it came not because they had failed to predict it, but because they could not bring themselves to prevent it. The Marianas had fallen. Japan's fate was sealed. What came after was just the working out of consequences that had become inevitable on those volcanic islands, 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. If you found this deep dive into one of World War II's pivotal moments compelling, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more detailed examinations of the battles, decisions, and turning points that shaped our world. History isn't just dates and facts. It's the stories of people facing impossible choices and living with the consequences. The fall of the Marianas is one of those stories, and understanding it helps us comprehend how wars end, and why leaders sometimes cannot accept what they know to be true.